Good afternoon. All right, everyone, good afternoon. My name is Aaron Alasa. I'm an associate with Aluko and Oyebode, and welcome to the 8th edition of the A&O Insider series. The theme for this webinar is the fintech legal landscape in Nigeria, licensing, legal, and regulatory compliance. And I am honored to have with me here Mr. David Oluranti, who is currently the head of legal and legal regulatory, the vice president of legal, regulatory, and government affairs at Flutterwave. David is an experienced commercial tech lawyer. He is adept at commercial law and practice, tech law, regulatory and compliance law, governance practices, administrative and arbitral hearings, courtroom representation, and client management. And before joining Flutterwave, he had gained experience at Criminal Defense Solicitors Temple in London, Immigration and Asylums Tribunal in London, London Probation in Hounslow, Strachan Partners in Lagos, PricewaterhouseCoopers and Librand in PwC Lagos, which is PwC Lagos, and Olaniwu Ajayi LP in Lagos. David likes to kick back with reading just about anything, playing basketball and or tennis, baking, running marathons, watching Formula One racing, and finding legal loopholes. He is a regular speaker at tech-related events, webinars, trainings, and lectures. His educational qualifications are an LLB from University of Lagos, a BL from Nigerian Law School, and an LLM from Brunel University, London. David, it is a pleasure to have you here with me today.
Thank you very much, Aaron. Pleasure to be here. And thank you guys for having me.
Yeah. From reading your bio, I can see that you've had a very diverse background in the legal industry, including criminal defense, civil litigation, tax and audit, property law, and now fintech. So I would just like to know how you developed your interest and built on your interest in fintech law, and what stage was it? Was it that you had always had an interest in fintech, and at some point you just decided, now is the time, it's time to
go? Nowadays, I think those who are coming up would have the luxury of maybe being able to divert their interest into the specific area of tech, being fintech. When I developed my interest, it wasn't necessarily in fintech per se, it was in tech law. And this was all the way back at undergrad level where, I'd come across some articles about how they were beginning to consider the use of technology in writing judgments in the state of California and the US, and that piqued my interest. But as at the time I was in school, nobody was really doing anything tech. And then at some point when I went for my master's and schooling abroad, obviously the use of tech then became more obvious. And so it piqued my interest. I did my dissertation for my master's around franchising and the use of technology in franchising. So that kind of accelerated that process as well. And by the time I finally started working at PwC, I developed this hunger for tech, and in Nigeria it was a budding industry, so I used to write a lot of articles then around data privacy, the use of tech, and that just kind of metamorphosized. PwC, as you know, is an accounting firm, so while I was working in the legal regulatory space, you also work with accountants and taxing. So the use of tech also then became even more glaring to me. I ended up working as well, heading a legal department at a mortgage bank. So that just encapsulated everything and made, the idea of financial services and the use of technology just come together.
That's awesome to hear. So your current role is Vice President in Flutterwave of Legal, Regulatory, and Government Affairs. So what does that encapsulate? Because I'm saying legal is just, one of the three things there. So it's not just being a head of legal. You have to consider more things.
In between the time I had agreed to join this webinar, my role has now changed as well and further metamorphosized. But it still involves legal, and in that role, I deal with everything legal, as well as regulatory in terms of dealing with your regulators, applying for licenses, reviews, audits, those kinds of things, as well as ensuring that, we have proper representation with legal authorities, law enforcement agencies, the commercial side of things as well. But, as we grow in the company, we're also looking to restructure that role as well, so that there's less, burden on one person to handle everything. And I will, going forward, be concentrating more on, the litigation side of things and seeing how that also grows. But generally in that role, you deal with regulators, you deal with law enforcement agencies, you deal with the government as well, represent the company at government panels and things like that. And it involves a lot of, tact, and not just going gung-ho as I'm a lawyer and everybody was listening to me.
So that's great. You mentioned dealing with these regulators. Can you give examples of these regulators? Who are they? How critical is their role in regulating this fintech ecosystem? Do they work together? Are their roles overlapping, or is there some synchronization?
If I'm to concentrate on Nigeria, which is why I believe we're talking about, what you will find is that there's not really much synchronization. I mean, when it comes to largely most of the areas that we deal with, sometimes when there's big number of fraud and things like that, maybe there's some sort of synchronization. But what you will find is we've not centralized our information into one place where anybody can, get that information and be able to use that information for whatever purpose that they require. However, it's been interesting, and the truth is, I do believe that there's room for improvement, and regulators are constantly also looking to improve within, the knowledge space and industry that they work in. In my experience, they take feedback, maybe not initiate or implement as quickly as we would like for us who are in the private sector, but at least they're willing to listen if you're willing to talk. Yeah.
That's good. That's good. Obviously, you want your regulators to be able to hear feedback and take it into consideration, so that the next time they are bringing out a regulation, a circular, or something else, it's with the stakeholders in mind. So
yes.
Turning now to the fintechs, like obviously you said in your time you've assisted with procuring licenses, engaging with these regulators. What advice would you give to maybe a growing fintech startup that so that it would ensure that it doesn't really face too much hurdles in procuring licenses, and to ensure that the road is smooth? Is it to get a lawyer that would break everything down to you, this is what you need to do, or is it engaging the regulator directly? What do you think they can do practically to ensure that I'm not just applying for a license because everybody's getting a PSSP, so it's a PSSP I want, things like that? What should they take into consideration?
I think that's an interesting question, and my own approach is to project manage that process, not because it can be done any other way, but because I feel like with project managing a licensing bid, what you find is you are able to have an overview of every single aspect of that process, and you're able to prepare for that in that process. If you're licensing within Nigeria, I would suggest that that's the best way to go about it. But in doing that, some of the things that a startup or any business at all should put in those processes will include stuff like doing your proper due diligence, like you rightly mentioned, engaging with the regulators. In my experience, I find that speaking to the regulators directly is always good. You find places where people avoid the regulators, or I've heard of a story from somebody else and just assume that that's the case. Usually they have, those helplines that you can reach out to where you're confused or not sure of what to be doing. So I think those help generally as well. Understand what those regulatory requirements are, read the policies over and over again. And that process should not just start and end with your lawyers. It should involve every single unit that will be involved, your compliance team, your regulatory team, your legal team, the product side of things. You want to be able to ensure that when you are standing before the regulator, they can see, they have a general overview of everything. And even when they're questioning you, your board pack, everything, your pack, already has everything that they're asking you those questions about. It's always important, being a lawyer, to seek proper legal advice. So if you have in-house support, that's good, but always ensure that there's a, external support to, also help you spot out things that you might be missing. And I also think that in this process as well, seeing that you are project managing it, the use of technology may also be very important and very useful for you in terms of, collating your documentation, making sure that you're sending them through secure links where people can download, who's downloading what, the privacy and the confidentiality of information being shared. All of that is always important when you're licensing and looking for licensing. In my experience, yes. I think those will help any startup any day, anywhere, to be able to go.
Thank you very much. That must be very useful. You said project management, having a good overview, pay attention to the requirements, ensure you have good due diligence, involve all the units in your growing startup, take proper legal advice, but also don't be afraid to engage the regulators directly, ask for help. And obviously use technology to ensure that the process in packaging your documents and your application pack is very, very seamless. Well, I also now want to face, what do you think those challenges are that these growing fintech startups could face prior to applying for a license? Obviously, maybe funding. Funding is always an issue for everything you want to do in this life. So obviously funding and other issues. What do you think these issues are, and how best do you think a growing fintech startup can, address them?
Funding is always important because if you want the best hands, you're going to have to pay the best hands at the best rates. I think most startups, usually before they even start looking for licensing, it's important that you have, some level of funding to back whatever you're going to use your license to do. In any case, these days, within my sector, getting licensing will mean that you already have a minimally viable product at some point that, it's ready to go to the market. I think, again, like I mentioned earlier, understanding what that regulatory space allows you to do with your product and planning what you want to do with your product prior to even beginning to look for that license helps. The market these days with fintechs is saturated, as you well know. There are a lot of them coming up these days, and in the Nigerian financial stroke economic sense, a lot of changes over the last few years have been very prominent, and I don't think that will stop anytime soon. Either a reversal in policy or a continuation or extension of a policy, effects and all of that. So it will affect the general kind of product that you're looking to to have. Question then will be, can that product evolve? Should there be a change in, if you're concentrating today on only crypto, and then the CBN comes and says, hey, we're banning crypto, what happens to your product after you've funded and received all those funds and you've applied for the license? So those are things that you need to put into consideration when, trying to develop and start with these things. I think it's also very important early to start with compliance and having a separate standalone compliance function, almost like you will find with most banks in Nigeria. It's important because you want a robust system that allows you to be able to take on whatever you find. And you will find that in this market, it can be very challenging in relation to things like, fraud, police invite, and things like that. So you want a compliance team that is fully structured, well administered, and understand the regulatory aspects of the business that you're about to go into, and the licensing implications to the license that you have.
That's very useful. I especially like what you said about a separate compliance function and the fact that the Nigerian landscape is always changing. So you have to be ready to evolve. You have to be ready to adapt. That I'm sure that's very useful to maybe some startup founder who is attending this webinar here. And drawing from what you said about that compliance function, recently we've heard reports about the CBN revoking some licenses, specifically mostly MFBs. What precautionary measures? Obviously, you said compliance from the start. How to address any issues that you could see coming ahead of you. But what other precautionary measures do you think they can take to avoid breaching your license and avoiding that kind of result?
Again, I don't think it's too complicated, really. It's always usually very simple. If you follow the steps, you will get the results. And starting from the very, very beginning and the base, get good legal support. You need people who know what they're doing to advise you. And when they advise you, please listen to that advice, because it's one thing to get advice from your lawyer, is another thing for you to actually implement that advice. But moving on from that, really, I do feel like, and it's quite unfortunate that MFBs had to go through that. Maybe as a result of the recapitalization that occurred in that industry, it became necessary for the central bank to do that. But I do feel like generally in the finance stroke business sector dealing with the CBN, it's important that you, like I'd mentioned earlier, get good legal support, ensure you have good compliance guys who understand what they need to be doing. Speak with the regulators. You'll be surprised that instead of outrightly banning you, if you had approached the regulator and been engaging with them, they're more likely to say, okay, let's give them a little more time while they fix up. These are teething pains that they are going through. Let's allow them that leeway, and they do have that ability to do that, and they do that in some cases. Also, I think you can't overemphasize the use of technology in terms of what your product is giving, in terms of how you deal with the CBN themselves and the other regulators, in ensuring that you're keeping track of what needs to be reported when it needs to be reported. When are you supposed to have your audits? You have your full year calendar. You already know what to expect in the first quarter, in the second quarter, third quarter, like that. It helps you really to be able to plan and to know where you are dropping the ball and how to quickly fix that. So that would be my advice to anyone who's looking to engage in that space.
Thank you. I especially like what you said about listening to your lawyers.
I mean, you'll find that, and it's quite unfortunate, really. You'll find that in most westernized parts of the world, lawyers are respected not just because they're lawyers, but because people listen to the advice that they get from their lawyers. In this part of the world, maybe not so much. People take action and then call their lawyers after.
Call their lawyers after.
Yes. Which is a lot more expensive. So if you're a startup and you're trying to avoid spending all that funding money on things that or wastage, in my opinion, get your lawyer to help you from the start, and it'll be easier.
Yeah, I second that a lot. So moving on from licensing, we know that technology, it requires constant innovation. Like you said, there are issues you would have to adapt. You have to innovate around those issues that just spring up out of nowhere. So how do you think fintech companies can balance this constant innovation on one hand and managing maybe sometimes strict regulatory requirements on the other hand? We've seen the CBN has given a go live to the CBN regulatory sandbox. It went live earlier this year. What do you think is the role of something like that in helping fintechs to balance these two things?
Thank you very much, Aaron. And I think it's very funny that you mentioned the regulatory sandbox coming to life, because I think one thing that the CBN did with the regulatory sandbox was to engage stakeholders from the very beginning. What do you guys think? How do you guys think we should go about this? And that's a sign that they're listening and they're adapting as well. So for the fintechs themselves who are looking to then go ahead and get into the space, as well as use the regulatory sandbox and be compliant, it's important that, again, going back to the basics, engage with your regulator, speak with them with everything that you do. One thing I like about the regulatory sandbox is it's let's call it a testing area. It's a time for you to grill your product, grill that technology that you think is going to be fantastic, that is going to revolutionize whatever you're doing. Think about it, put it in that sandbox, let the regulators also begin to test it and use it, and then be able to point out, hey, there's slow updating, slow uptime, downtime, whatever it is, these functions don't work, there's no connection to your customer service, I cannot reach anybody on the end of your product. It makes sense for that to be there and to help. What I'm most afraid of is a scenario in which people then get into the regulatory sandbox and are not helped out of it to then go live and become a product in the market. And I hope that the regulators are not looking at it as a place for products to die. Of course, there's a time period for that product to be within the regulatory sandbox. I believe it's about 6 months or so. And I think you're allowed to put that product twice or so within the sandbox. But I think what's more important and what founders or product owners should be looking at in sitting in that sandbox is that's an opportunity to actually hear the regulators tell you what is wrong with your product.
Yeah.
And I also find that in listening to the regulators tell you how to fix that product, you most likely will find another way to better improve that product or innovate on the space or on something that they hadn't thought about before. So like I mentioned, if your business has been all around crypto and cryptocurrency, if there's a ban tomorrow, what are you thinking about? How do your customers get their money? Are they able to ensure that their money is not lost because crypto has now been banned? Those kinds of things will come out as a result of being in that sandbox. I also expect that, again, if we were to use the example of the crypto, any product who is in that sandbox is offered insights into, this product line that you're looking to do. We as the regulators, we appreciate what you're trying to do here, but we don't think that, in another 365 days, this is something we expect to be in the market. So maybe you want to tweak it here and there. So it's a great opportunity for, regulators and the business owners to sit and discuss that product. And good enough, the regulations also cover, confidentiality of the product that you have in the market. And we expect that, the regulators will keep to that and ensure that there's no situation where competitors, gain an advantage because someone has gone and put their product in the sandbox.
So that's great. At least it shows that the regulators are listening, and it shows what kind of progress can be made when they engage stakeholders first. Aside the regulatory sandbox, do you think there's any regulatory policies that you think could maybe further assist growing fintech startups?
Recently there's now a Data Privacy Act. It widens the scope for practitioners like ourselves, So again, like I said, when I started, there was no fintech. Now there's fintech. Now there's data privacy. So people then begin to expand their specializations and their possibilities. It also expands the business, because you have to go through this audit process, sit down and ensure that your data is properly protected. So for me, that is one good example of regulation that would help. I know that, and maybe I shouldn't say too much, the CBN are looking to revamp, around, the FX market and ensuring that things are a little more stabilized in that sector. And this helps with people who, for instance, who are licensed IMTOs, for instance, international money transfer, it's important that those rates are stabilized so that what your profit margins are, and if this is a business that you want to also continue in. I think the SEC themselves have also kind of been innovative around certain regulations that they are bringing out as well. I do believe that there was something, I forget what it was called, but basically to try and help tech companies and fintechs, to be able to begin to IPO on the local market and be able to also get funds. When it comes to me, I'll mention it, but I think those are regulations that will help in the long run with any businesses that are starting. In the last administration in Nigeria, I know there was a lot of talk around ease of doing business, integrating CAC, NIPC, and all of those. Hopefully those come to fruition. CAC is mostly digitalized these days, so incorporation is a lot faster. Back in the day, you will find lawyers in their gown and everything sweating in front of the CAC office. You don't need to do that these days. Yeah. So that's improvement. Maybe not as fast as we want, but I think eventually we'll get there. It will be nice to see more fintechs be able to raise funds and get funds locally instead of from abroad, especially in the era where, as you well know, we're trying to raise FX, and we have a lot of people who have invested in the country and want to also pull out the FX. To avoid that whole brouhaha. Think about it this way: if you were a company who had investors from abroad and raised $5-10 million, and then you're supposed to pay at a certain rate. With all these FX changes, you have to double your efforts in ensuring that you pay, especially if you're making your money in local currency. So there needs to be regulation that kind of helps, not necessarily just one time. There's just a decree and everything just shuts down, and then you begin to scramble. It helps. It gives you a time range, and people are able to walk around those issues. But it will be nice that you're able to raise more funding locally, and that way you don't feel too much of that pressure when those economic decrees are made. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. That's really helpful. It shows that we have a long way to go, but we have made so much progress, and we can be hopeful about what comes next. So moving on from growing fintechs and startups to larger unicorns, like yourself. What do you think are some of the issues that companies or unicorns like yours face? Obviously, you are growing, you're expanding to several countries. So regulation and compliance is not just a national or local issue for you. It's now an international issue. So how do you, jump through all these hurdles? And, obviously you've given us a lot of advice on managing your compliance operationally. So how is it for, larger fintech companies in different countries?
To be honest, I don't think that there's much difference, except that whatever you do now becomes times 10 bigger, mega news. So, I mean, because you're a unicorn doesn't mean that you won't go through the licensing process like everybody else. Doesn't mean that necessarily you get more favor. As a matter of fact, you get more scrutiny. So if I'm to be honest, I feel like you then become even more aware of those challenges. And I think the word to put to that encapsulates everything would be risk management.
Okay.
For you who is big, it's a question of managing the risk in the process. If you follow the same steps, you project manage your licensing applications or whatever, any regulatory functions, you project manage it so that you know what the next steps are, you are aware of everything. It's always important to look for where the risks lie, because again, for you, the negativity or the news is times 10 what it would normally be if you were just a smaller startup. Of course, being a unicorn doesn't mean that you also don't have to, watch out for your investors and ensure that they also get returns for their investment in you. So, there's also that part of managing investments and ensuring that those don't spill out. And all of that also goes back into the regulatory aspect of things in terms of, getting it right there, because you don't want to end up in the news and then having to explain to people, oh, no, they're wrong. This is what might have happened, or all of that is unnecessary. If you want to maintain that status as, the big player in the field, then you need to get those simple things very correctly from the very start. Another thing to watch out for if you're a unicorn or a big one is again the complex and rapidly changing regulatory environment and landscape. The ability to anticipate even before it comes then becomes times 10 your responsibility, right? And the only way you can anticipate that is to work with the regulators closely, not run away from the regulators, right? Because somebody would inadvertently say something that will give you some inclination as to, oh, this is the mindset and this is where these guys are looking to go. And then you can immediately begin to adapt that for your business. So yeah, it's always important, whether big or small, to be able to do that. I think the major difference with the size of the company or the business, it usually is the effect in news cycles and the punishment that you get. So of course, if they're going to fine you, they're going to also fine you mega because hey, you're mega. So I think those are majorly the differences, and for any bigger business, it's important that you put in the structure for those aspects.
Thank you. As we are, winding down a bit, I would like to ask the audience, if you have any questions, we'll try to take one or two for the speaker. You can post in the chat box. So one of my last questions to you is that, the fintech legal landscape, like you said, is evolving, is going to keep growing, is going to keep changing. Regulators are going to keep trying to encourage startups to come in and try, and improve and grow. The regulator also wants you to grow, and the fintech also wants the regulators to to do their job as well. So where do you see the Nigerian fintech landscape in the next 5 to 10 years? Personally, I think there will be some sort of regulation of AI, because I mean, AI is rapidly growing. The things it could do last year, it's doing times 10 now. So do you think there could be some intersection between artificial intelligence in, financial services? Would there be some world where a fintech and a bank are incorporating AI into their banking apps, or to use it to offer financial services to people just based on their financial history? And what do you think the regulators will jump into that? And where do you think that could go, as an example?
I absolutely agree with you. AI is taking over everywhere. Anyone who didn't attend this webinar and took any questions that have been asked and dumps them on some AI app will probably get similar answers. So my own knowledge base and experience has already been encapsulated by AI. And I do agree that with respect to financial services, that's one way to go. I don't know if anyone recalls how, a certain bank, I think it was UBA, had a chat box.
Yeah.
And that kind of revamped, the use of their apps and things like that.
Yeah.
I think you will be finding that a lot of financial services firms have also adapted the use of chatbox, and chatbox is just the smallest aspect of what AI will do for you. I mean, it's basically ensuring that your customers can reach you and tell you their complaints at any point in time, regardless of time, day, region, or weather. It's simple, is useful. And I don't think that there's anybody who works in the financial space that doesn't realize that the main thing a customer wants to have is the ability to connect with his money and his use of his money at any single time that he wants. If there are now websites I can log into and ensure that I can transfer my cash, then why can't there be a place where I can reach out and speak to you about my issues? Yeah. So, of course, I do believe that there will be a lot of improvement with the use of AI, a lot of improvement with the use of blockchain technology. I think I heard somewhere that Nigeria was now looking into a blockchain policy or something like that. That will be interesting to see what the use of that will be, because I think largely a lot of people have looked at blockchain as, in connection with crypto, only fraudsters use it and all of that. There's always a good side to technology, really, as well as the bad side. So you always find more use of that in the system. I think, a lot of virtual services as well will continue to grow. I remember when ATMs first came into play and everybody was wondering, what the hell? I need to speak to a machine to get my money. These days, they've gone a step further. There are I don't know what they call them in Lagos these days, but there are banking spaces where you just have machines and you deposit and withdraw your money, and you don't have to walk into a banking hall. Fintechs are also rising, InsurTech, all of these tech spaces are kind of incorporating, better services in relation to providing financial services. So I do feel like it's going to be amazing. In 10 years, I expect that it will completely have changed from where we are, hopefully. And the reason being that, again, our phones are getting smarter. We have the use of QR now. NIBS has issued the QR policy and use of QR, which means that I can just scan a code and make my payment. I can transfer my money scanning a code. And I think all of that will evolve to the point where it's a lot more simpler. I've heard now, I mean, we use fingerprints right now. We have 2FA and all of that. So I do think that there's a lot to be excited about in terms of fintech and the business space. Banks as well are now having their own fintech companies that kind of cater to the smaller market. I think what may be important in the use of all of this technology is how inclusive is it for people outside of the system. I think that's where the regulator should, put in more effort and push in helping the fintechs in terms of, we have all these things, BVN, NIN, all of that. Can we centralize everything and make sure that it's easy for the market woman tomorrow to just simply pick up a phone and do our transactions? In East Africa, they have M-Pesa. You pick up your phone and in a minute you send money to anybody, anywhere, without actually going into an app or anything like that. I think those are the directions that we should be looking at. And I think in the next decade, those are the things that will be springing up from time to time. But like I mentioned earlier, further strengthening of the use of AI, you'll be seeing that a lot more. And the adaptability of apps to your needs without you basically speaking. We already see some of that with things like Google, where if you keep repeating a word constantly around your phone and it picks up, that you begin to see products like that all over the place. But you're wondering what happened. So this intuitive use of AI will continue to happen. In the use of blockchain, because it's actually quite secure, will continue to happen in the financial sector. And I hope that, and I pray that eventually it brings more inclusivity into the financial system.
Thank you very much. That was very insightful. I think we are actually headed for exciting times, and I'm very interested to see how the financial services and sector and the regulators also react to this. So we'll just take about 2 or 3 questions if you're up for that from the audience. Sure. Yeah. So the first question from Efemina Iloezi or Baudu. Sorry if I butchered your name, Efemina. So he says, great conversation so far. Given that David mentioned that he was switching roles to focus more on disputes, I wonder what his experience has been on the disputes front. I'm assuming amicable settlement has been the priority, but what has his experience been like with courts and other dispute resolution processes?
Interested. In my career, I've had actually a lot of interactions in terms of disputes and dispute resolution and ensuring that, both alternative dispute resolution and litigation, both, come favorable for clients and companies that I've worked with. I do feel like there's a lot of knowledge gap. It's slowly getting there, but, the problem with the industry that I work in and, the law and, especially towards litigation and all of that, is that it grinds quite slowly. and you then have innovation that is moving at speed of light. So there needs to be that closing of the gap, helping both the judiciary, law enforcement, everybody understand what exactly has happened. You hear cases of transactions gone bad, and next thing, police is arresting people and locking people up. Should that be the procedure? Can it be better? If we're tracing fraudsters, can it be easier if there's a database and all of that? I think we'll eventually get there. It takes time with some of these things, and they're listening. But if you're a founder here, my advice would be engage with them as well. If they know you, they see you regularly, they understand the concerns of your business. By the time you have 2 or 3 reports or 2 or 3 cases in court, that judge will be better off with, how things work in your space versus just expecting them to do it all on their own. So I think there has to be that collaboration as well. But in my experience, I think the knowledge gap is the biggest challenge, but slowly and surely we'll overcome it.
All right. Thank you very much. The next question is from Gregory Inca Greg. What are some of the common misconceptions people have about fintech lawyers, and how can they be dispelled?
Wear a lot of t-shirts and jeans. So most people look at you and say, hey, are you sure he's a lawyer? And you see a lot of us that are bearded, maybe not looking like we're going to court and all of that. So of course that's a big misconception without anybody looking at you. And I think the best way to just dispel that is show how intelligent you are. I mean, and when I say that, it doesn't necessarily mean begin to brag just to make somebody feel like you actually do. But I mean, if you have to speak up, it doesn't matter that you're wearing a t-shirt. Sometimes just adapting to the culture, and I know that we're now in the Gen Z era where, there's a lot of laxity with some of these things. but adapting to the culture of the place where you're working, or the people you are meeting up with, or the people you're going to be working with also helps. So even if they say it's dressed down, I mean, you could dress down and still look, respectable without looking like, oh, hey, this person is crazy. Other misconceptions are usually that, so if you come to the core technical side, you would hear people who, you don't see too many lawyers who are capable of writing code.
Yeah.
You don't see too many lawyers who understand, the difference between front end and back end, and all of that. It's good to be well grounded. I always say that it's something that I'm lucky that I had principals who kind of put that in me from my younger days, that it doesn't matter how you present. What matters is that you're grounded and you know what you're doing. The other things then come after that. So I think that's my most important advice.
Thank you. And the last question will be taken from Fumilola Aliu. She says, for a young lawyer who wants to venture into the fintech space, what should a person be doing now? What skills should be developed, and what kind of jobs should they be keeping an eye on?
I think it depends on the level that you're at. If I could go back to school now, I will be doing a lot more internships, around tech, that develop the technical side of it, while I'm also working on my legal skills, right? So at that level, I think it's important. I say that in the developed world, it's now compulsory to have coding classes, right? Yeah. And people are learning to write code even at the minutest of levels. Yeah. So for the guys who are developing as well, it may be important to start looking into that aspect. You'll be surprised what you can learn and how it helps you understand even the legal aspects of things better. The tech space is very wide, Now there are opportunities around data privacy, data protection, and there are courses around the world, certifications to take that give you that acceleration that you need. There's the compliance side of things as well. There are compliance certifications that you can take. Technical side, there's also things like, data analysis and use of data. And the truth is, if we're talking about things like AI and blockchain, they all sit on data. And so the person who is able to manage data, mine data actually, are the people who will be the billionaires of the future, right? So it's important that you also begin to look into those kinds of things to understand how they work, and also help your own legal mind in being able to help your clients, either if it's on the dispute resolution side, litigation, or commercial side of things. I think those aspects are very important. A colleague of mine just messaged me and said that to the last question, another misconception that people have about fintech lawyers is that they have money. So I've said it now. I hope you guys know that maybe we don't have all the money, but yeah.
I'm sorry, I don't agree with you, David.
So, I mean, at least I represented that fact.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. So that will be the last audience question. And I'll just be posing to you some quick hot seat questions, which you would have to answer in under a minute. Okay, so the first is, if you were to introduce one regulation right now in the Nigerian fintech landscape, what would it be and why? You could borrow from any country, or
I think, given what I do, a centralized space for mining data around fraud, e-fraud, and things like that will be most welcome, both from law enforcement, judgments, even businesses. If I know that this person had gone on that platform and performed fraud before, then it helps. It's not just good enough to blacklist. And then when somebody comes over to my side, I then go and check whether, let's just have a centralized system that allows us have that. I think that will be very good for regulatory, legal and compliance.
Okay, thank you very much for that. So the second question is, if I gave you
I mean, I have my own personal goals. I'm very big on legal tech. So of course I'll be investing in my own personal business. Aside that, I do feel like the money market is underrated. It's good to look in there. We know the traditional means of always investing, which is, land, landed property and stuff. So there will be a little bit of that in there. But generally, I do feel like tech companies and removing Flutterwave from the mix, the bigger ones, they're all there. If you sit down with the market, you get a good investment company, you will get good options around that. Anybody who is wise as well, given all the recent administrative or the recent administration's declarations around oil and gas, it makes sense for you to go put your money there because it seems like the returns will be great. So yeah.
All right. The last question is, what is your life's philosophy?
It's two things. One, treat others how you want to be treated, which is all encapsulated under, love your neighbor as you love yourself. And two is basically, put in the hard work. You can't overemphasize it. We now live in a generation or a world where getting there quickly or fast is the goal. But you also have to realize that you can get there fast, but if there's no substance to it, it all falls apart eventually. So, be grounded, do the hard work. Does it mean that you should suffer for life? No, it just means put in the work, learn the things that you need to learn, and you will eventually get that step high that you want to.
Thank you very, very much for that, David. And thank you so much for the time. Thank you for answering the questions. I see that we have over 120 something participants. I'm sure a lot of them, if not all of them, have learned at least one thing here today. Thank you for everything. And that will bring us to the end of the Aluko and Oyebode Insider Series 8 edition. Thank you all, and thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much, Aaron. It was a pleasure doing this. Thank you, Aluko and Oyebode. Cheers.
Cheers.